Sony's PC release strategy has been heavily led by Insomniac and Nixxes, the PC porting specialist PlayStation acquired in 2021, who've been a key factor in those successes. Now, Spider-Man 2 was Sony's quickest PlayStation to PC release yet. Has that rapid pace impacted the quality of the port?
That was your idea? Never said it was a good one!
Extra features, options, and many PS5 Pro graphics updates that boosted the visuals over the base PS5 have become the norm for most PlayStation PC releases. The PC and PS5 Pro update last year featured increased ray trace reflections with higher resolution and sample reflection rates over the base PS5, which only utilised half resolution and sample rates. Sunlight can now use ray trace shadows further out, mixed with shorter cascades of shadow maps closer to the camera. Ambient occlusion is now boosted with ray tracing over SSAO, and ray trace GI outdoor is also enhanced. On PC, many of these are increased further. Most specifically, the proxy objects within the BVH used for shadows and reflections are higher and can be pushed further out. Now, this is a big cost on CPU time though, and it defaults to 6 when enabled, which is likely what the PS5 runs this setting at. Testing the PS5 Pro against PC, the performance mode is a mix of 6 and higher, with Fidelity Pro closer to 10, but it's actually a mix of between 6 and 8, or at least as close as I can align anyway. Pushing to 10 improves the range that all these BVH samples are made at, but it will increase hardware demand, so only high-end CPUs and machines should go above 6, and many of them may well go lower to claw back some performance. Hair quality, traffic and pedestrian density, reflection quality and frequency can also go higher. But the most obvious is ambient occlusion, which enhances the self-shadowing on static and character objects such as faces. Beyond this, many effects are bumped up over the previous heights of PS5, namely level of detail, ray trace geometry, hair effects, along with resolution and frame rate targets. The ray trace geometry is fixed at very high once you enable shadows and or GI. Although that should align to what we see on the PS5 Pro, we can actually see there's less objects in the BVH than there is on the highest settings on PC, and that makes sense because, again, limited memory and that calculation of getting the best bang for buck. As you can see in these ground reflections, there's less moving objects and reflective objects in the floor from PS5 at fidelity mode than it is on the maximum settings of PC. Ultra-wide support, input choices, and the full suite of XeSS, FSR 3.1, and DLSS complete with CNN and transformer ray reconstruction, which boost image quality complemented with frame generation and NVIDIA's Reflex low latency, which can be enabled with or without multi-frame generation, which could be very important here. The options offered within the menu, enhancements over the base PS5, possibly higher frame rates and modes of play, are all very welcome and create another strong PC-tailored release from Nixxes as a basis. Easy and fast menu use, no long shader compilation, instead all async as before, quickly as the level loads. Aside a small crunch at startup or when you change settings, you are getting a more console-like experience here. Loading is fast, SSDs need only apply, and it still looks great across a wide range of PC hardware. But therein lies the rub.
Don't see any bad guys. Maybe Miles and Genki had it wrong?
The engine in game can scale well, as low as the Steam Deck and up to the heady heights of the RTX 5090. However, it does not scale well above the target spec of the PS5, and the quality and performance is far from ideal on most hardware specs I tested. Even with top-end hardware, the game is obviously memory limited, which manifests in data seeks, heavy CPU usage, GPU bubbles, and thus API in DirectX 12 and or driver limited. I have covered this in depth before, but Insomniac's engine and games have been used as a pioneer of pushing the key benefits of the PS5 architecture, that being high data throughput, high occupancy data use, and just-in-time data streaming to maximize the limited 16GB of GDDR6 unified pool of RAM it has. As per prior games, this means extensive use of those dedicated I/O streaming processors, high dependency on the SSD to keep things fed via the modern DMA access, cache scrubbers, along with the unified memory system, are all pivotal ingredients of rendering logic, physics, animation elements via GPU compute work. This all manifests on PC with high CPU demands, far in excess of the Zen 2 CPU in the PS5. PCI traffic is swamped, rebar or SAM data sharing is vital, as GPU and CPU compute work all mean the vastly different PC architecture struggles when on the move or when swapping between shots in real-time cutscenes or zipping in and out of portals and even spinning the camera around. Now, some of these issues are even true on the PS5 and the PS5 Pro, in that many of the biggest issues were, and remain, present in the core engine code on PS5, just to a lesser or less intrusive degree, due to many factors outside of the scope of this video. But the short version is, the tools, SDK, architecture and APIs the game is built with enable the team to hand-tailor it to the specifics of the hardware and software stack. Now, this gives Nixies a huge breadth of specifications to support and a limited choice of options and tools to mitigate the issues. Resolution is not likely. Which brings us to performance, which is not the only issue, but it is a big one. The maxed out settings of ray tracing, level of detail, textures, hair effects all put even more pressure on the host hardware. Memory is the biggest cost. The game uses far more RAM than PS5, as most things need dual copies across both pools. This causes more data management, copies, bandwidth, coherency, stale data, cache impacts and more, which presents as erratic and inconsistent frame times, even on the best hardware I can throw at it. My top-end RTX 5090 paired with the Zen 4 7950X 3D, that's a 16-core 32-thread CPU and 64GB of GDDR6 6200MT RAM, we can use over 16GB of VRAM and even more system RAM. The opening section is a prime example pitted against the PS5 Pro in its 4K performance RT mode with unlocked VRR, which is putting more pressure on that data and CPU elements. We can see the engine really targets that 16 millisecond frame time, but it can break into 8 milliseconds when not shifting just as much data. It uses PSSR now to hit 4K from a lower base. Image quality is great and close enough to DLSS Style 3 here. Ray reconstruction can both use the older CNN or newer transformer model, more on that shortly. Although the PC can achieve higher frame times and thus rates than the PS5 Pro, this is not always the case.
Set Mr. Airstick down, but not before he barfed on my suit.
He's not the only one. Sandman just puked out some new friends.
What the? He can do that?
When low down on street level, lots of objects, cars, people, animation, physics, skidding, streaming, even this machine struggles, and we see times bouncing from 8 milliseconds up to 50 to 60 milliseconds often, causing sub 60 FPS bouts which are obvious to see and feel. Now, much of the sections are not GPU limited, even at 4K DLSS quality, but data limited, which causes bottlenecks across the system and big bubbles in GPU utilization.
That's Sandman?
MJ wasn't kidding. We gotta help him before he hurts someone.
My RTX 4090 paired with my still great 5800X 3D and 32GB of DDR RAM, 3800 MHz, can again suffer with the same problems, and this machine is slightly worse due to slower system RAM, mostly bandwidth and latency, but also the 4090 is marginally slower than the 5090, so it takes slightly longer to do the work when it can in less time. Meaning in this same run we can see mid-40s at the same settings, only around 5 to 10% slower during this run, but again, it leaves it running worse than the PlayStation 5, albeit at higher visual settings and certainly ray tracing. My AMD RX 6800 machine paired with a 5600X 6-core 12-thread CPU is a perfect medium to high-end machine, but I struggled to get the game to run. Constant crashes due to memory limits meant that I had to set the game to 1440p with a close alignment to the high settings, but all ray tracing effects on, but not at the maximum level. We still get constant crashes, GPU loss in Windows, and likely memory stomp, API fails, and as you can see in this video, this pops up saying buffer space is gone, but the game still runs and controls behind it. So it's likely an issue with the API driver from AMD, the engine itself, who knows. We have just under 1GB remaining in the system page file in VRAM, and similar in VRAM itself, with shared elements within smart access memory, and this may actually be a bug that is causing this problem on my AMD machine, or again, driver related to AMD itself. This is the same as on Nvidia. We get bugs, heavy CPU usage, even more so on my 5600X, which is maxed out often, and then these crashes frequently means it's not playable at present or even stable in this current build, and it certainly needs to be patched and updated quickly. Now you can drop seconds closer to the sweet spot. Effectively high is a closer match for the PS5 Pro's Performance Pro mode. With ray trace reflections, ray trace water bodies though, rather than SSR, you need to bump up to very high reflections. At high, my aging RTX 2070, which can still choose old or new Transformer Ray Recon, can target 60 FPS at 1440p DLSS balanced. Although it can never really hit 60 FPS, 30 FPS is the aim here without frame generation. It can be GPU bound at times. On this more entry level machine, we are far more memory bandwidth and CPU bound. The aging 2700 8-core 16-thread CPU and 32MHz DDR4 RAM can slow things down. Even at these lower settings, we are still shifting a ton of data at all times, causing very poor bouts of frame times, which feel unplayable on mouse and keyboard and terrible on a controller. When not limited by these, the GPU is good for high 30s to low 40s, and disabling ray tracing and reducing level of detail could also help a little, but a smooth 60 FPS is not possible here. Finally, the RTX 4050 shows that a PS4 Pro version, at least in theory, may have been possible on the GPU front. Well, aside the SSD and CPU challenges, it has to run at 1080p DLSS quality with no ray tracing, but we see better performance than on my RTX 2070 rig, helped by the faster Intel CPU. But again, we are closer to a 30 FPS cap than a 60 FPS one, unless we again enable frame generation to smooth out those frame times to better match a 60Hz display, but I don't recommend it at these low levels. You can play on the Steam Deck, but even at the lowest settings, 800p FSR3 balanced, performance is often as bad as the worst sections on my RTX 2070 tests, with frame times being very erratic when zipping around the city, which simply cannot be avoided. It is playable, but certainly not smooth, and it's still affected by creepy crawlies of a different kind, like all specs. The arguably bigger problem is the sheer amount of bugs the game has. It's clearly 6 to 10 weeks from release ready, in my opinion. Memory leaks, high overhead, ray tracing specifically, and possible debugging things left active cause huge spikes in RAM use. I had crashes on my rigs, AMD by far the most affected due to running out of buffer space and or driver related as noted. Then we have the high level of visual and gaming impact bugs from DLSS causing hair to fizzle and pop as the denoiser fails and then works, which is a bug on PS5 Pro also on occasion with PSSR, although far less frequent than PC. Evidence that this is within the render code and not introduced by this port. As we also have odd NPC and enemy behaviours which occur more often on PC. We see textures on puzzles disappearing, possibly due to depth sorting or precision issues. Textures and shadows can flicker and fizzle. The ray traced AO, GI and shadows break down often, both in CNN and Transformer models, but the Transformer model is affected most, which includes heavy ghosting. As such, I recommend the CNN version until this is fixed. Stippled impacting on shadows, AO across walls and faces from the lack of denoising stand out. The whites of characters' eyes can flash on and off. The lighting changes or extra lighting passes can miss sunken areas, causing eyes to glow, skin to look flat, washing faces and features out when in direct sunlight, making skin and models look worse, which all points to the art team being heavily involved, or at least they should have been. Depth of field can be very low resolution and dithered, which looks noisy even at the highest settings, and game impacting bugs cause checkpoints to fail when enemies are knocked into the ocean, forcing a restart. Button prompts don't complete. Controller inputs fail in some sections, and you have to fix these using mouse and keyboard. And many of these will be memory or API related, but they all add up to a constant swathe of bugs that impact quality, performance, gameplay, visuals and enjoyment, but worst, the amount of crashes I had across every piece of hardware. And right now that makes for a worst experience over the PS5 versions, no matter what hardware you are running, even with the enhanced visuals and options. And as of this video just finishing off, they released another patch which is around the 6th, which fixes some of the issues I've just mentioned, but there's still many more to fix. Nix's acquisition by Sony was a sound one, creating an in-house collaborative cross-platform development studio, aimed to deliver the best balance of allowing the main studio to develop the game with the PS5 platform first and foremost, and then Nix's to be a support team that has direct access to the code, the tools and team to enable a smoother, more efficient and above all better quality of console to PC ports. Spider-Man 2 was an even bigger ass than the first game, as it has no PS4 port, lower assets quality and design from the get-go. As such, the demands we saw then have now drastically increased across all areas on the PC front. It can still scale and runs on the Steam Deck, which shows that AMD hardware is not the issue. More API drivers and the chasm of difference the PC platform has and requires over a fixed hardware spec console. But the speed of this port, the level of the increased demands, and the final result in gamers' hands leaves a very negative view of what is a monumental task. In this reviewer's technical opinion, this game, in its current build, is not release ready. The ray tracing features are the biggest demand, and likely due to them being designed with Nvidia RTX in mind, understandably so, which DX12 is also focused on, means Nvidia players do get a better experience, although far from a high quality one. AMD GPUs suffer far more, and based on my testing, is broken currently for those players unless you lower settings below expectations, or now, as they've noted in their latest patch, remove the ability to use the low latency feature until they figure that out. Patches have come thick and fast, more will come, and we have provided feedback during our review, and maybe a launch at the end of March would have been the much better choice, but as it currently stands, 1 week after launch when we got code, I cannot recommend this port on any PC spec, which I do say with sadness. I hope the team gets the time to fix all these issues over the next month or so, and we get a more polished and stable version that we have come to expect from Nix's and PlayStation ports as a whole.
Next week, we were gonna make a potato-powered helicopter.
I'm so sorry.
And that's it for the deep dive into game technology, video game performance, and all things PC related. Remember, if you like what we do here on IG,